like to welcome members to the 25th meeting of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee in 2020. Our first item today is Stage 2 proceedings on the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill, and I'd like to welcome Graham Day, MSP, Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans, and his accompanying officials. I would highlight that officials are not permitted to speak on record during the formal proceedings. I also welcome Anis Sarwar and Adam Tompkins, who have lodged amendments to the bill and are attending the meeting remotely. Welcome to both of you. Everyone should have a copy of the bill as introduced and the marshalled list of amendments, which sets out the amendments in order in which they will be disposed of and the groupings. Now, given that this is a hybrid meeting, I would emphasise that voting in divisions is by show of hands. It's important that members keep their hands clearly raised until the clerks have recorded their votes. I also wish to say at the outset that if we have any tied votes on any amendments, I will, as convener, vote as I voted in the division, and I will do that consistently throughout the process. So I hope that's all clear to everybody, and I now move on to the first group and refer you to the scripted marshal list. I move on to the first group, and we come to section 3. Well, first of all, the question is that sections 1 and 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much for that. Section 3 then, and section 3, deadline for application for postal votes, call Amendment 18 in the name of Anis Sarwar in a group of its own, and I ask Anis Sarwar to move and speak to Amendment 18, please. Anis.
Good morning, Convener and the committee, and thank you for your time this morning. Can I just say right from the outset that I want to emphasise what I said at the Stage 1 debate. This is a bill that I want us to have consensus on. I think it's important in terms of the public message that we all, as all the political parties represented in the Parliament, are on the same page in the conduct of the election. I also realise that I have a number of amendments this morning, so I can promise you brevity and to the point as well, Convener. I don't want to hold up the committee for any longer than it needs to be. This amendment is a simple one. It was referenced by many colleagues in the Stage 1 last week that it felt counterintuitive that at the same time as saying we wanted to encourage or we're expecting more people to sign up for a postal vote at the same, or the need for a postal vote, at the same time we were talking about bringing the deadline forward by 2 weeks. So this was an amendment to try and tease out more detail about the rationale behind bringing that forward, given the fact that it is counterintuitive and we expect more applications, and the dangers of a late surge of applications, meaning the opposite effect, which is people being disenfranchised and not able to get their postal vote rather than an overrun ERO service. Alongside that, I think it's important to emphasise that there's adequate resourcing for EROs. I recognise that's a separate amendment, so I'll come to that in more detail later. But a final point just on this before we open it up is I think there's a mitigation here in terms of how we can avoid a late flood, and that is having an early public information campaign. So I'm keen to hear from the Minister how early we can have a public information campaign and the scope of it. I realise again some of that is in a later amendment, but I think it's connected to this, is how early that public information campaign is going to be, how soon those booklets are going to go out to households, because I think all of those things could mitigate that earlier deadline. And in an ideal world, I think that campaign should be starting, if not in the end of January, then at least the beginning of February, so there is that early onset. And with that, I will move the amendment in my name and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Anis Sarwar. And any members have anything they'd like to contribute at the moment to this? Patrick Harvey, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I think Anis Sarwar is raising issues in this amendment that many of us have expressed concern about, but I think that more consistent with the evidence that we took at Stage 1 would be the idea that these concerns need to be addressed by the scaling up of capacity for postal vote registration. I don't think that the evidence at Stage 1 necessarily lent itself to the removal of the section. So I wonder if, when he has the opportunity to close on this, if he would reflect on whether the real way to address these concerns is to continue to put pressure on all the relevant organisations to say that even an upper estimate of 40% postal vote take-up it may well be enough, but it may not be enough, and that we need to prepare for a higher capacity rather than removing this provision from the bill.
Thank you very much for that. And Gil Patterson, please.
Yeah, it's a similar concern. Good morning, everybody. We're told that we are looking at a 40% or below 40%, and we're preparing for a 50% turnout. And my concern is that if we over-publicise a postal ballot, do we put fear into the mind of the public that there's dangers involved in turning up to vote? And the other thing is, what is a critical mass? We're told that for an all Scotland ballot, a postal ballot, it would take 6 months to plan for and put mechanisms in place for that to happen. And that's the purpose of, I believe, that we are having our election, remaining MSPs until the day before the election, so the Parliament can vote if an emergency happens. So I would ask the government to think about what is or tell us what the critical number is when, you know, where is it 55% becomes unmanageable? Is it 60%? I really don't know. I've looked for that information. I haven't asked that question before, but I was looking for it and I can't find it.
Okay, thank you, Gil. And Jamie Halker-Johnson, then Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I mean, I have real concerns with this. I recognise some of the points that have been made, and I appreciate to some extent where Anna Sarwar is coming from on this. And also, you know, the resource issues are obviously one thing that's come up again and again during the evidence, but also during the evidence there were the concerns that whatever the deadline is, there will be applications right up to it, and it's a question of that volume and whether that volume is manageable. And so if that section was removed, do we simply provide a situation where there is such a volume still coming in late and a shorter period to be able to determine and to process and to verify those applications? And I'd be interested if Annis could address that, and perhaps the Minister as well, in their contributions, because I think that would be a real concern in terms of causing a very late stage backlog of applications that could either see delays or could see people disenfranchised.
Thank you, Jamie. Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everybody. I understand why we are having this deadline for postal votes. It's not just about the checking that the postal vote application is correct. It's about making sure that ballots come back as early as possible, because I think there's more verification and scrutiny to be done at that stage when the ballots come back. And we wouldn't want to be waiting for results because we're waiting for postal ballots. I did ask the Minister during the Stage 1 debate, although he didn't have time to give me an answer, whether, I mean, I know we can get proxy voting till later, but make sure that in the advice that goes out with this, that we make sure that people, as far as possible, can get votes right up to kind of the normal deadline, and that nobody's disenfranchised by the fact that we have this 3 weeks.
Thank you. Right, and I think John Scott, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. I agree with Patrick Harvey on this. I think that the two issues are being conflated, and I do think that this section should remain, and for the reasons that we heard as well during the evidence that we took from the experts, that there is a need for this early deadline. And therefore Section 18, in my view, should stay in place.
Thank you very much, John. And Neil Findlay, please.
I think what's quite depressing, actually, during all of this, is the very conservative nature of what we're talking about here, that we simply cannot organise this. It's all so difficult, and we've not got the resources. Now, you know, a couple of years ago, the Greek people organised 2 referendums in a fortnight, and yet we knew an election's coming. We knew there was COVID. We knew that potentially we were going to have these problems, and yet we're sitting here at the very last gasp, still debating how we can maximise the number of people participating in the election. And you know, Gil suggests that, you know, if we over-promote postal voting, then you know, people will fear turning out. People are going to fear turning out anyway, because we're in the middle of a COVID crisis. We should be we're not promoting at any other time them not participating in the normal way of voting. We're not in normal times. We're in extraordinary times, and more people than ever will want to exercise a postal vote, in my opinion, and we should be doing everything possible to ensure that we do that, and do that as effectively as we can.
Thank you, Neil. Just very quickly, I think it was prompted by you saying that people were being conservative at the moment, but Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kavita. I'm not sure if we can intervene in this stage, but just to say, I mean, I'm sure the member will recognise that whatever the resource that's in place, there will be potential bumps along the road. For example, say if there are outbreaks, say if there's a large number of proxy votes needed, and the same people that will be likely to be having to do all the work around postal voting will be required to do proxy and some of these other things. And you know, the idea of bringing the deadline forward slightly is to allow that capacity within the system. We don't want to get to a situation, I would have thought, and I'm sure the member would agree, where the same people are looking to have to administer postal votes and to deal with perhaps late proxies and a number of the other things that always come up during election. And I just think we ought to be concerned about that when we're deciding on this amendment today.
Thank you very much. Minister, would you like to respond, please?
Yeah, and there's a lot to respond to, Convener. I think from what we've heard this morning, it's an illustration of why actually this is a really useful amendment insofar as it provokes discussion of the subject. We are opposed to the amendment, as you might imagine. So if I may, Convener, I'll go through that and then I'll respond to the points that members have made. I can understand why reducing the amount of time in which people can apply for a postal vote has attracted this attention. It is counterintuitive when we're talking about aiming to significantly increase postal voting from 18% of the electorate to 40 or even 50%. And I would say to Mr Finlay, I think that's worth reflecting on. 18% to up to 50% is, I would contend, hardly conservative in our ambitions. But Section 3 of the bill, by moving the deadline from the 20th to the 6th of April, makes a change that was directly requested by electoral professionals. Indeed, it's probably one of the key changes in the bill from their perspective, given that electoral registration officers will have to process around 900,000 new applications to achieve that increase to 40%. And processing of postal vote applications poses a challenge for EROs ahead of any polling day, with many people choosing to apply on or close to the application deadline. Amendment 18 risks it not being possible to process the expected increase in applications. Electoral professionals have been clear that there's a risk that some people would effectively lose their vote. Now, whilst in-person voting would remain an option for these individuals, if they've chosen to apply to vote by post, I think it's safe to assume that they either cannot or do not want to vote in person. And from my perspective, it would be unacceptable that those who've applied for a postal vote by the application deadline were denied their vote because it couldn't be processed in time. It would impinge on the legitimacy of the election. So rather than increasing participation, Amendment 18 could end up depriving people of their vote if they cannot vote in person or by proxy, which I know is not what Mr Sarwar wants. Electoral professionals have also made clear that this is not a problem that can be resolved by resources alone. I think the committee took evidence to that effect. Now, we've already agreed an initial allocation of £3 million to assist the EROs with this, and further funding will be made available as actual costs are incurred, and I'll expand on that in a second if I may, Convener. It's a question of training, managing systems and having the necessary expertise in place. This takes time. We need to give the electoral experts in our electoral community the time they need to do their jobs. And that means building in resilience to ensure that all of the postal vote applications can be processed and postal votes issued in time. Supporting Amendment 18 would ignore the expert advice we've received and opens us up to a very risky course of action that could actually prevent some voters from voting, which, as I say, I think is unthinkable. But if I may, Convener, to respond to some of the points made. Mr Sarwar's correct that the mitigation that he seeks is to be found in early information campaigns. From my perspective, those need to be delivered locally. So the interaction is between local ROs and local electors. So as members will appreciate, this is an expedited bill. We are moving through this quite quickly. What I can tell members is that we are looking to have a meeting at the beginning of next week with the Electoral Commission and with the EMB to tease out exactly what's happening on the ground in terms of those campaigns. We have obviously have a broad idea, but what we have at the moment is there are obviously there's some constituencies where there is a high uptake of postal votes, higher than average already. We've got some constituencies where the EROs have already committed within the £3 million that's available to them to localise campaigns. Now, we will be actively encouraging amongst the 15 EROs to do just that, using whatever means they feel are appropriate. There is a £2 million budget still sitting there, and the government is committed to putting more money into this if that's what needed. But I think what's pivotal here is that local interaction between the EROs and the local electorate, with campaigns tailored to those local circumstances. And I will be happy to report back to members at the stage 3 as to exactly where we have progressed that. Maureen Watt talked about the issue about processing and close to deadline. In 2016, 3% of postal votes weren't counted because of issues identified in the ratification process. So there is an issue there. It's one of the things that's fed into this. We need to give maximum opportunity to the electoral authorities to maximise the chance of postal votes being deemed valid. Patrick Harvey's point about capacity, the capacity that is provided for at the moment isn't just 40%. It allows for the a surge to 50%. I think there was evidence the committee received from Pete Wildman about that. So what they have here essentially is a capacity to handle 40% and then a bit of leeway in the final couple of weeks up to deadline if there was a significant surge. And I think in terms of the 40% going up to 50%. So I would give the assurance that that Anna Sarwar was seeking there about we can counter the downside, if you like, of an earlier deadline by getting that information out earlier, encouraging a smooth uptake, but significant uptake of postal votes as people feel the need to.
Thank you very much for that. And Anis Sarwar, to wind up, press or withdraw Amendment 18, please, Anis.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just pick up on a few points? I think Neil Findlay is right that it does seem as if we have a can't-do attitude with some of this, not with all of it, but with some of it rather than a can-do attitude. I think it's important that we increase the awareness that people can use their postal vote, but actually we should also make it easier for people to vote as well. And I think if we look at examples from other parts of the world, I think you see other parts of the world making their processes easier, smoother, increasing the time for things for the electorate to do rather than decreasing the time. And again, so I would just emphasise the counterintuitive nature of what we are discussing here at the moment. I think there's a few things to add to that. One is I think we need much clearer reassurance about when the public information campaign will start. It's got to start early. It's got to start very early if it is to be successful. I don't think there is any risk of over-publicising the need to or the ability to use a postal vote. If we're asking people to think twice, 3 times, 4 times or 5 times before they go to a local shop, restaurant or supermarket, then people are naturally going to think 3 times, 4 times, 5 times or whether they go to the local polling station as well. So I don't think that argument holds water, to be honest. In terms of the capacity for the EROs, I think it's really important that they do have the skill and capacity. We should not be saying that there's a risk of disenfranchising the electorate because the EROs might not be adequately trained or adequately resourced enough. We've got to make sure we have a responsibility to protect our democracy, that they are adequately resourced as much as they need to be. And we want to make sure we process ballots early, process applications early as well. But in the spirit of consensus, I'm not going to push this amendment to a vote, but I still think we need some clarification ahead of stage 3 about when specifically the public information campaign will start, what specifically that public information campaign will include, and what specifically additional resources will be provided to local EROs in order for them to process those applications. And if we can't get that ahead of stage 3, then I may well be bringing this amendment back at stage 3. But in the spirit of consensus, I hope we can work together to find a reasonable resolution. So I withdraw the amendment.
Well, thank you very much, Anas Sarwar. Okay then, so that is being withdrawn. The question is that section 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And we are, and thank you very much, and thank you everyone. Thank you very much. Okay then, so section 4, which is on the report on uptake of postal voting at the closing date for the election. Call Amendment 1 in the name of the Minister, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Please.
Convener, Section 4 of the bill sets out the requirements for a report the Scottish Ministers are obliged to publish after the new deadline for postal vote applications. This report is intended to outline the number of voters in Scotland who have registered for a postal vote or who have an application for a postal vote pending. This report will be made at a time when registration officers will be extremely busy processing the expected increase in postal vote applications. Whilst it's vital that we have data on progress with postal voting levels, we need to ensure that collating data for the report under this section does not distract registration officers from that task of processing. The government amendments in this group seek to ensure this by responding to concerns raised by registration officers. Amendment 1 changes the reference to 7th April in section 4.1 to reflect that the information used in the preparation of the report will be the most current information available, but not necessarily the exact figures as at that date. The purpose of the report is to indicate the number of voters who are likely to be registered for postal votes at the election. Amendment 2 makes some changes to the information which is required to be set out in the report to ensure that that picture is as clear as possible. Requiring that the report states that total number of voters registered to vote at the election provides context to the other figures. This detail, alongside the number of postal votes granted, allows for the calculation of the percentage of postal votes already granted and the maximum number that could be granted. Some pending applications will be duplicates or rejected for other reasons. Amendment 3 is a minor change to reflect the fact that the report will be based on the information which is available at 7th April. Preparation of the report cannot begin until after that date. Turning to the other amendments in this group, I note that Mr Sarwar and Mr Finlay are also seeking to amend the report outlined in section 4. Whilst I sympathise with the intention being displayed here, I'm afraid I cannot support these amendments. The principle behind Amendment 19 is a laudable one, but the idea requires further refinement. It's not clear from the amendment whether the intention is for the report to contain detail on the additional resources provided by the Scottish Government, and it is rather confusing to be focused on resources provided specifically as at 7th April rather than more generally. However, I recognise the merit of clear information on resourcing, and in the spirit of cooperation and consensus that Mr Sarwar has emphasised, I ask that he withdraw Amendment 19 on the understanding that I'll prepare a similar amendment for Stage 3 or work with him on such. Mr Finlay's Amendment 20 is more problematic. Electoral professionals advise that the number of people entitled to vote at the election would be extremely difficult to determine accurately. My Amendment 2 responds to that by referring to persons registered instead. While the government would compile the report, gathering this data would have to be undertaken by EROs. For example, they would have to investigate instances of people who've not yet registered to vote. I'm sure that the members will agree additional demands on EROs' time would not be a welcome move for May 2021. They must be allowed to focus on registering voters, especially with the expected increase in postal vote applications. I understand Mr Finlay's intent, but we have already collaborated with stakeholders to carefully craft Amendment 2, which will give us valuable illustrative data on voter numbers without causing unnecessary additional work. This includes sufficient data to allow the calculation of numbers of registered voters who have not applied for postal vote. Conversely, Amendment 20 would require EROs to down tools at a time when they should be allowed to get on with the task of registration. I hope colleagues will support Amendments 1, 2 and 3. I ask Mr Sarwar to withdraw Amendment 19 and work with me on a suitable Stage 3 alternative, and ask Mr Finlay not to press Amendment 20. I would urge members not to support either of these, however, if they were pressed.
Thank you, Minister. Anis Sarwar then to speak to Amendment 19 and other amendments in the group, please. Anis.
Thank you very much again, Convener. I'm happy to work with the Minister on his suggested reworking of the amendment for Stage 3. I think we do, I hope, both want the same outcome from the amendment. This amendment was purely designed so we can have a plan of resources published and made available about what amount of resources and funding is going to be made available to EROs through the process of additional postal votes, both in terms of public information and indeed the processing of the postal votes. But I take the points the Minister makes, and I'm happy to withdraw the amendment and work with him on a suitable amendment for Stage 3.
Well, thank you very much, Anis Sarwar. And Neil Finlay to speak to Amendment 20 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thanks, Convener. Amendment 20 requires ministers to report the number of electors who have not applied for a postal vote by 7th of April 2021, a month before the election. It means ministers must report the total number of persons entitled to vote at the election who have been granted a postal vote for that election, and the number of pending applications for a postal vote, and the number who have not applied. This will allow electoral registration officers to plan for safe voting, the safe provision of PPE and any other health and safety materials, and if there are concerns about turnout, then the further promotion of the election and the reasons why voting will be safe. Putting the number that have not applied for a postal vote will therefore show the number of potential voters on the day, giving organisers the idea of capacity issues that they might face. It's a straightforward provision of a number that should not be onerous in any way.
Thank you very much, Neil. Any other members have anything to contribute at this point before we go to the Minister? And Patrick Harvey, please.
Thanks very much. Just to say, I'm pleased that the government seems willing to work with Anis Sarwar on a replacement for his amendment in this group. When I read the amendment, it seemed reasonable in its intention, but I wasn't clear what resources would really refer to, and I think perhaps something that has greater definition at Stage 3 might be beneficial. In relation to Neil Finlay's amendment, I'm afraid I'm still a little bit unclear why the number of electors who haven't applied is relevant information that's needed. I mean, the electoral administrators will never be able to know in advance precisely how many people are going to turn up to vote in person. And turnout is the far bigger variable, the far bigger unknown, rather than the number of people who haven't applied for a postal vote. So there will always be that level of uncertainty about how many people are going to turn up to vote in person. And I'm not entirely clear why the information sought by Amendment 20 is actually relevant information of use.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. And I think we're ready to go to the Minister now, please. Thank you. Would you like to wind up, please, Minister?
Thanks, Convener. And briefly, let me first of all thank Anis Sarwar for his constructive approach with his amendment. The point's been made that the number of electors, i.e. people who are registered vote, is a bit of a moving feast. Patrick Harvey's correct. And just to summarise, I think my amendments will deliver pretty similar outcomes to those that Neil Finlay is seeking, but in a more practical and pragmatic way, and in keeping with the ask of the electoral professionals.
Thank you very much for that. Okay then, so the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. And call Amendment 2 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Convener.
Thank you very much. Okay, the question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much for that. Okay. Call Amendment 19 again in the name of Anis Sarwar, already debated with Amendment 1. Anis Sarwar, to move or not move, please?
Not moved, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, does any other member wish to move that amendment? There is not anyone. Okay. Okay, so that amendment is not moved. The question then is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No, we're not, because it's been moved. Not moved, so I beg your pardon. It's got to score things out more quickly. So we're moving on to calling Amendment 20 in the name of Neil Finlay, already debated with Amendment 1. And Neil Finlay, to move or not move, please?
Move.
Moved. Thank you very much. Thank you. So the question is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No, we're not. And therefore, hold on a wee second, I'm just checking something. There will be a division, I thought that, yes. So we will have to go to a vote on that then, and hands will be shown, and therefore those in favour, yep. Those in favour, raise their hands now, please. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And those against, please. Thank you. Right. And any abstentions at all? I don't think so, because I think everybody raised their hand there. Thank you very much. So the vote result there is on Amendment 20 in the name of Neil Finlay is yes 1, no 6. There were no abstentions, and therefore the amendment is not agreed to. Okay, and thank you very much for that. Okay, so I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally.
Move, Convener.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And we are. Thank you. And the question is Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And we are. Okay. And thank you all very much indeed. Call return of postal vote to be free of charge, and I call Amendment 21 in the name of Anis Sarwar in a group of its own. Anis Sarwar, to move and speak to Amendment 21, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. This one's quite a simple one. It kind of connects to what I was saying at the outset of our discussions this morning. This simply can't just be about raising awareness of the ability of people to vote by post. It needs to also be about making it easier for people to apply to vote by post. I recognise and accept that when an ERO sends an application form out, it includes a free post return mechanism. But my understanding from the government and the Minister is that the Electoral Commission will be sending out a booklet to every household across the country, telling them of their ability to vote by post. Again, I think it's counterintuitive that we would send a booklet out to every household, but the ability to vote directly with that through that booklet and that mailing is not going to be available. If we're sending every household a booklet, surely we should also be sending every household with that booklet an application to vote by post, a link for where they can get more applications, and a return mechanism that is free from that application. If we fail to do that, then actually what we're doing is we're adding layers of process rather than reducing layers of process. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. If you get a booklet through the post, and actually we've all probably done this on terms of different campaigns, in terms of when we do political campaigns, is we have a response mechanism built in to the communication we make with the electorate. There is going to be no response mechanism built in with these booklets. So what will happen is, rather than someone getting a booklet, they read the booklet, they recognise they can vote by post, they complete their form, and they send it straight back in. Instead, what that person is going to be asked to do is, 1, hope they open the envelope. 2nd, hope they read the booklet. 3rd, hope they get to the bit where it tells them the information for their own local ERO. 4th, they go either on the website to see that ERO's office, if they have access to internet at the time. 5th, find out where on that website they can email the ERO. 6th, send the email to the ERO. 7th, receive a mailing from the ERO. 8th, hope they open the mailing from the ERO. 9th, read the mailing from the ERO. 10th action, actually return the postal application to the ERO, all adding complication, not making it easier, but adding a process. Conversely, when they can go onto the website and they can find the phone number for the ERO, they can then phone the ERO. And if they phone the ERO, one, they've got to hope that they answer the call. And if we're expecting more and more people to be contacting the ERO, that might make it much more difficult for the EROs to be answering the calls, perhaps stay on hold for a very, very long time to the ERO, and then again go through that process of the ERO responding to them with the application. Or the third option they have when they go on the ERO's website is printing off the form themselves and then having to go out, get a stamp, get an envelope, put the application form in and post it in, meaning they have to pay to get the right to vote in the election. It's simply counterintuitive. So if we want to make it easier for people to be able to vote, if they're getting a booklet through the post anyway, why not include an application form within that booklet and a mechanism for them to respond for free in that booklet? I accept that that means there's going to be something coming much earlier centrally to one place if we decide to do one national mailing in terms of the booklets rather than by local authority areas. But surely the argument goes then that's why we're bringing the deadline 2 weeks earlier, because it gives us the ability to be able to do those actions that are required early enough in order for to sort those postal votes out. So I just think, again, we can talk up the fact we're going to do an awareness campaign. It's not simply about making it people more aware. It's about making it easier for people to exercise their democratic right as well. And that's why I hope that we can get reassurance from that from the Minister and we can get support for this. I'm not talking about a massive cost to the electorate in terms of a free post mechanism. I understand the dangers of a free post mechanism. I have a free post mechanism. I know sometimes I get unpopular things through that free post mechanism, but that's not a reason to disenfranchise the entire electorate. So I do please encourage, look at this very, very carefully. And again, make sure that booklet goes out as early as is possible. We are relying on every member of the electorate being fully informed. We've got to be honest, most of the electorate are not fully informed most of the time, and they're certainly not informed about this process we're going through right now. And so we've got to make it as easy as possible for people when they get that booklet that they're encouraged to open it, and it's easier for them to take the action that's required in order for them to exercise their democratic right.
Yep, are you moving this, Anas?
I am moving that at the moment.
You are moving it, okay. Thank you very much for that then. Anyone else have anything they'd like to contribute at this point? Patrick Carvery, please.
Thank you, Convener. I suppose I feel about this amendment a little bit the way I did about Amendment 19 from Anas Sarwar, in that it's raising very important issues, that it's onto something that we should address, but I'm not entirely clear yet whether this precise amendment is the way to achieve it. I think we should be looking to reduce as much as possible and hopefully eliminate any barriers, not only of cost, but of difficulty in people exercising their vote, including exercising a postal vote. And I do think that the government needs to respond in a constructive way to this amendment. I don't know whether that means agreeing this amendment or responding in a different way, but I'm interested to hear what the Minister is going to have to say about it. In particular, I think Anas Sarwar's argument that the booklet that's coming from the Electoral Commission is the way to deliver the whether it's an application form, whether it's a free post sticker or envelope or something. The amendment is about Scottish ministers making provision. So I'm not entirely clear that this amendment would achieve the solution that he's sketched out there in moving the amendment. So, yeah, I want to see us achieving what Anas Sarwar is asking us to try and achieve here. I'm not yet clear whether this amendment is the way to do it, but I would like to hear something substantial from the Minister about what he intends to do, either by way of an alternative amendment at stage 3 or other action that doesn't require a change to the bill.
Thank you, Patrick. And Neil Finlay?
Yeah, I think this is a test of how serious we are about opening up voting to as many people as possible. Anas Sarwar eloquently explained all of the steps that you have to go through if you want to get a postal vote and all of the potential barriers there are to that. You know, this would be a cost-effective way of reaching every single voter with the material they need to register for a vote. Straightforward, simple, with no financial barrier. For the life of me, I don't know why we would be opposed to such a move. And I think this is a genuine test. We've got the opportunity to either say lots of more warm words and rhetoric about our desire to see more people voting at election and taking up the opportunity for postal votes, or we've got the opportunity to do something practically and pragmatically about it. And I would appeal to members to support the amendment.
Thank you. Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thanks very much indeed. I mean, I recognise some of the points that Anasa was making in that. I'm still slightly unconvinced. I mean, it was quite a long list of barriers, but I'm not sure in certainly some of those cases how this would change that. I do have concerns about the onus is put here on Scottish ministers as well, and I agree to some extent with what Patrick Harvey is saying. I think this would be interesting to hear from the Minister whether there can be more work between Anas Sarwar and the Minister to bring something that may be more suitable or may have slightly more impact at this. But as I say, I do have those concerns with it at this stage.
Thank you, Jamie. And Minister, please, could you respond?
Convener, thank you. Amendment 21 proposed by Anas Sarwar seeks to create a new section which places a duty on Scottish ministers to make provision to ensure that postal voting in relation to the 2021 election is conducted at no cost to the voter, and in particular that this must include the provision of free post envelopes. The Scottish Government does not support this amendment. It is a solution in search of a problem. As I explained in my letter to the committee the 26th November, each postal vote is already cast at no cost to the individual voter using a first-class addressed envelope supplied by the returning officer. The parliamentary election rules require that the returning officer include such an envelope in each voting pack unless it's sent outside the UK. Now, I appreciate that Mr Sarwar may have been seeking to also make the application process free in every case, but that's not the effect of his amendment. In any event, EROs have already committed to issuing first-class addressed envelopes with all postal vote application forms that they send ahead of the May election. The cost of this will be met from the £3 million additional funding which has been allocated.
I don't really think we've got time if we're going to start this, actually. I think everybody's had a chance to speak. I'm sorry about this, but I think we have to press on. Very short, please.
Just very quickly, does the Minister accept that in order to contact the electoral registration officer, many people write to them and that requires money?
I don't accept that they would write to them at all, Mr Finlay. There's various means. And I'm going to come on to some of this because I think you have a slight misunderstanding of the process that are followed here. So as I said, the cost will be met from the £3 million additional funding which is allocated to address the anticipated increase in postal vote. As a result, all those who obtain an application form directly from a registration officer will avoid postage costs. And it should also be noted, Convener, that voters can now send in their applications by email as a result of recently introduced reforms to the annual canvass process. So they could download the form, complete it, they can scan it, or they can photograph it and send it in. That will have the signature on it. I consider that encouraging members of the public to apply for a postal vote via a registration officer is the best option here. Certainly it would be preferable to establishing separate free post addresses for each individual registration office. And I want to pick up on a couple of points that were made. A number of members have highlighted the fact that the booklet comes from the Electoral Commission. What we are seeking to do is have an engagement with the Electoral Commission around the timing of the booklet, but also to request that within the booklet they provide details for local EROs, the contact details, whether it be the opportunity to download a form or whatever. And that dialogue is ongoing. I would point out, and I don't want to get into the territory that Anas Sarwar did of listing a whole range of difficulties, but there are a number of difficulties that arise from this approach. And it may seem a rather small one, but by way of example, sending out a postal vote form in the booklet, we would be largely dependent on when the booklet went out so as not to create a surge late on in the day, and we are in discussions with the Electoral Commission about the timing of the booklet. There's also the point of if you only have one form, you're then requiring people other members of the household to then get in touch with the EROs. And there is also a risk, convener, of duplication. People may have applied for a form already. They've not heard back from their local EROs. They think, well, I might as well just send it in again. And that creates further challenges for EROs in the process that they are going through. So I would ask Anas Sarwar not to press this amendment, and if he does, I would urge the committee not to support it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, I think we gave that a good run. So Anas Sarwar, to wind up, press or withdraw Amendment 21, please. Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Convener. I've got to say I'm disappointed by the Minister's response. I think it's unfortunate that he talks about a solution in search of a problem. Actually, there's a problem and I'm in search of a solution. I would have hoped that the Minister would be helpful in trying to find the solution rather than to just come up with a snappy soundbite. I think other members perhaps do get the point I'm trying to make. I'm happy to accept the point made by Patrick Harvie that the drafting as just now may not be the solution to the problem that I'm raising. And I would have hoped that the Minister would have agreed that he would have worked with us to try and find an amendment that would work at stage 3. So before I make a decision on whether to push the amendment or not, if the Minister's not willing to find a common ground about how we can come together on a stage 3 amendment or even a practical, something that doesn't require an amendment but practical solution on this, then I would urge please Patrick Harvie and Jamie Halcrow-Johnson on behalf of the other parties to work with us to try and find a solution to what I think is a problem. I don't think we can underestimate the fact that we're sending out a booklet to every household. How many of us read booklets that come to our household doors? How many of the electorate are actually going to read that booklet page for page and go and find which one of their 32 local authorities, 32 listed phone numbers and email addresses, is the one related to them in a wider booklet? So I just think it goes back to Neil Findlay's point about, are we serious about this? And if we're serious about it, then we've got to try and find how we make it easier for people to apply to vote by post, not just make them more aware of how they apply by post. And if we're spending the money to post a booklet to every single household in the country, why would we not take the opportunity in that very mailing to give people the application form? And I don't buy the argument about duplicate applications. People will know if they've got a postal vote. If there's the odd duplicate application, people can be informed of the fact that there's duplicate. There might be duplicate applications from people phoning the EROs to double check whether they've got a postal vote or not. I also don't accept the point about single person households. Take Glasgow as an example. Over 40% of households in Glasgow are single person households. So someone can apply and then also go on and see if they want additional application forms as well. So before I decide whether I push the amendment or not, I look to please Patrick Harvie, please feel free to intervene on me and also Jamie Halcrow-Johnson if they are willing to please work with us to find a solution to this problem that either is in the form of an amendment or in terms of a practical exercise, because I would hope that we want the same thing here.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, well, as Patrick Harvie is willing, it will have to be quite a short intervention, please, Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. Very briefly, I would say that I'm happy to reflect on the whole discussion, including Anas Sarwar's comments and the Minister's, and see whether there are other opportunities to address this issue, either at stage 3 or in another way. I do think there are substantial issues here, and we should all be open to discussing them and trying to find a solution.
Right, well, thank you. And as we've allowed Patrick and better, Jamie was mentioned also. So Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, please.
Thanks very much, and very, very briefly, as I say, I take the points that have been made during this discussion, but I can't support this amendment as it sits at the moment. If there's further discussion between Anas Sarwar and the Minister and something comes back at stage 3, we'll review it then, but I'm afraid I can't support this amendment now.
Okay. Right, well, thank you very much. Anas Sarwar, to press or withdraw Amendment 21 then, please.
I wasn't asking whether Jamie Halcrow-Johnson was going to support or not support the amendment, because I took from his comment earlier that he wasn't going to support. I was looking more for an encouraging response about whether we can try and make it easier for people to vote by post. But I'm happy to take that conversation with Mr. Harvie separate to the committee and try again with the Minister separate to the committee. So at this stage, I will not press the amendment, but I do intend to come back to stage 3 with something along these lines or modified on these lines in order to make sure that we're actually being serious about trying to encourage the electorate to vote and exercise their democratic rights.
Well, thank you very much for that, Anas Sarwar. So Anas Sarwar has indicated he wishes to withdraw. Therefore, does any member wish to object to the amendment being withdrawn? You do not. Okay. And I'd just like to thank Anas Sarwar for that then. So section 5 is the power to provide for all postal votes. And I'd like to call Amendment 22 in the name of Neil Finlay, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Neil Finlay, please.
22. Thanks, Convener. This amendment restricts the regulatory powers of ministers to provide for an all-postal ballot and ensures that any decision should only be taken where it is necessary for COVID-related reasons. Parliamentary scrutiny and approval is essential for this, in my view. So I'd be interested to hear what the government is proposing in terms of ensuring Parliament is involved in such a move. But the amendment seeks to restrict those powers to ensure that it is only where it is relating to COVID measures.
Okay. Thank you. And are you moving?
Yes, move them.
Yes, you are. Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you. And Minister, to speak to Amendment 4 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. I think there is broad agreement that an all-postal election is undesirable and should be viewed as a measure of last resort. That's certainly been the government's view throughout this process. We've also stressed that the power in Section 5 is very much a contingency measure, since an all-postal election could only be delivered if the election were to be postponed. Mr Finlay's Amendment 22 and an aspect of Mr Tompkins's Amendment 7 propose that there must be a coronavirus-related reason for making regulations for an all-postal vote. I have to say I cannot see any circumstances in which the power would be used to arrange an all-postal vote next year that was not tied to coronavirus. However, as Amendment 22 reinforces that position, I'm happy to accept it. Government Amendments 4 and 6 would make the delegated power to make provision for an all-postal election subject to the affirmative procedure. This implements and indeed goes further than the recommendation of the DPLR committee in its Stage 1 report on the bill. On reflection, we agree with DPLRC that if this power were to be used, its significance is such that it is appropriate that there is parliamentary scrutiny. Amendment 5 provides an additional safeguard in the exercise of the power of Scottish ministers to provide for an all-postal vote. This is in response to concerns expressed by the committee in its Stage 1 report regarding the width of the power. The effect of Amendment 5 is that ministers must lay a statement of reasons for making any regulations under Section 5, which must include information on the responses received from the persons whom ministers are required to consult before making the regulations. That is the presiding officer, the Electoral Commission and the convener of the Electoral Management Board, as well as the Chief Medical Officer. Mr Tompkins's Amendment 7 overlaps with the other amendments in the group. It also seeks to make use of the power subject to the affirmative procedure, but imposes different restrictions. Overall, the government amendments and Mr Finlay's amendment cover 2/3 of Amendment 7. The remaining aspect of Amendment 7 sets out that the regulations can only be made with the consent of the presiding officer, the Electoral Commission and the convener of the EMB. I'm not persuaded that this limitation is required. The proposed change of applying affirmative procedure should be a sufficient check here. Parliament would decide, having had the opportunity of considering any views those persons and bodies had wished to put forward. As a result, I would ask Mr Tompkins not to press his amendment, but if he does, I would ask the committee not to support it. Turning to Mr Sarwar's Amendment 23, which would require ministers to publicise arrangements for an all-postal ballot. An all-postal ballot is an emergency contingency measure. The amendment as drafted treats it as a certainty. Furthermore, the reference to adequate resourcing is too vague for including in legislation. Amendment 23 also contrasts, convener, with Mr Sarwar's Amendment 25 in Group 7, which seeks to prevent the government from issuing information in relation to the 2021 election. However, I do not disagree with the idea that any all-postal vote would need to be very clearly publicised, and much of this would be done by the Electoral Commission. Therefore, I do not think that the focus on Scottish ministers in Amendment 23 is appropriate. Therefore, I would invite Mr Tompkins and Mr Sarwar not to press their amendments in this group, but if they are pressed, I would invite the committee not to support them. But I invite the committee to support the amendments in this group in my name.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, welcome to Adam Tompkins. He's been sitting there for a wee while. Adam Tompkins to speak to Amendment 7, please. Thank you.
Good morning, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for accommodating me today. We think that having a power in this bill to provide for the eventuality of an all-postal ballot in next year's election, where that election will have to be delayed for reason relating to coronavirus, is eminently sensible, but we do not think that that power should be in the hands of ministers or ministers alone. We think that the power should be exercisable only for a reason relating to coronavirus, and for that reason we're very pleased to see the government support Neil Findlay's Amendment 22, which we will also support. And we think that the amendment, that the power should be subject to the affirmative procedure, and for that reason we're very pleased also to support Graham Day's Amendments 4, 5 and 6. As the Minister has already said, that covers the substantial ground that was sought to be covered in my Amendment 7. So if Amendments 22, 4, 5 and 6 are accepted by the committee, then I won't press Amendment 7 this morning, Convener. With regard to Mr Sarwar's Amendment 23, the question which I would put to him is indeed the same as the question which the Minister has already put to him, which is why is there an apparent conflict between what he's requiring Scottish ministers to do in his Amendment 23 and what he's saying later on in his Amendment 25, which provides that any information in relation to the 2021 election must be provided by the Electoral Commission, the convener of the EMB or EROs, and not the Scottish ministers. Now, in the Stage 1 debate last week, Mr Sarwar spoke very forcefully, and I agreed with him when he said that Scottish ministers must understand that they are participants in this election and cannot therefore be its referees. So why is it that there should be a duty on Scottish ministers to promote public awareness relating to the election when that is already the statutory responsibility of the Electoral Commission? For those reasons, I would request Mr Sarwar not to press his Amendment 23, because I think it conflicts with the laudable aims that he's seeking to achieve elsewhere. And as I say, I won't press Amendment 7 if Amendments 22, 4, 5 and 6 are accepted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam Tompkins. Anis Sarwar to speak to Amendment 23 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with all the comments relating to Amendments 22, 4, 5, 6 and 7. On Amendment 23, this is purely a probing amendment, purely to have a discussion about something or a comment about something else, and it's not something that I am planning to push. And that question relates to the use of radio, television, postal and online communications. What I'm requesting here is not that the government conducts these issues. What I'm looking for from the Minister is whether they will be publishing, for the benefit of Parliament, a schedule of activity of the public information campaign that will be conducted by the Electoral Commission, but of course funded by the Scottish Government and the wider Scottish Parliament, and whether what that schedule of activity looks like, the scope and scale of it, the start of it, and whether it will include radio, television, postal and online communications in the round. So it's a request to have that schedule of information published, and I will not be pushing the actual amendment.
You will not. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Anis Sarwar. And Neil Findlay, please, to wind up. And
nothing to add other than thank the Minister for accepting the amendment.
Yep, thank you very much. Okay, and so you're accepting then, right? You're not pressing, is what I mean. Beg your pardon. Okay then, so you are pressing. Sorry, beg your pardon. Right. Okay. And never gave the Minister a wee chance to come back on things there, if you'd like to.
Thank you for your indulgence, Convener. Just to pick up on Anis Sarwar's point, it's not an unreasonable ask for some sort of publication of the schedule planned, and I'm happy to give that commitment that we will do that in due course.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so Neil Findlay, sorry, beg pardon, Neil, actually. Neil, to wind up and press or withdraw.
Nothing to add, and I'll press the amendment.
You will press the amendment. Thank you very much for that. So the question is that Amendment 22 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, sorry for a wee hiccup there. Call Amendments 4, 5 and 6 all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. I invite the Minister to move Amendments 4 to 6 en bloc.
Moved, Convener.
Thank you. Does any member object to that being moved en bloc? I don't think so. Okay. Then we will move on to calling Amendment 7 in the name of Adam Tompkins. I'm being told that I'm jumping ahead again here. Hold on. Right, if no member objects. The question is that Amendments 4, 5 and 6 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. Sorry. Just circumventing democracy there. Sorry about that a wee bit. Right. Okay. So I will now call Amendment 7 in the name of Adam Tompkins, already debated with Amendment 22, and Adam Tompkins to move or not move, please.
Sorry, Convener, but you need to say what the result was of the previous vote, because I don't know what the result was, not being in the room.
They were agreed.
Were Amendments 4, 5 and 6 agreed?
Oh, yes, they were. Beg your pardon. Yes, they were. Sorry, it's the external sort of visual. I hadn't actually picked up on that. They have been agreed. Yes, they have.
Thank you. So if Amendments 22, 4, 5 and 6 have been agreed, I will not press Amendment 7.
You'll not press. Right. Sorry, I do apologise, Mr Tompkins. That was my fault there. Does any other member wish to move the amendment? Nope. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. So thank you to everyone. Sorry, Mr Tompkins. That was my fault there. The question is that Section 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay. We are all agreed, and thank you very much indeed. Call Amendment 23 in the name of Anis Sarwar, which was already debated with Amendment 22. Anis Sarwar to move or not move, please?
Not moved, Convener.
Not moved. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, does any other member wish to move the amendment? No other member wishes to move, so that is not moved, and thank you very much. So the question is that Section 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And we are. Section 6 is all agreed. Thank you all very much indeed. Section 7, dissolution of current Parliament and consequential modifications. I'd like to call Amendment 8 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendment 9. So, Minister, to move Amendment 8 and speak to both amendments in the group, please. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Convener. These are technical amendments to ensure the correct policy intention in line with normal electoral arrangements. This is regards, firstly, the date when a person becomes a candidate for the 2021 election, and secondly, the timing of the duty on electoral registration officers to supply electoral registers to local authority returning officers. These rules are usually calculated by reference to the dissolution of the Parliament, but given the planned dissolution of only one day, Section 7 of the bill instead ties these rules to the expected start of the campaign recess. So the policy intention is for both rules to kick in 28 days before the poll takes place. But under the Scotland Act 1998, the day of the poll itself has to be included in the calculation of that 28 days. Therefore, the number of days stated in Section 7 of the bill at introduction has to be reduced by 1. The effect of Amendment 8 is consequently that a person's legal status as a candidate will begin on the 25th March 2021 and not 24th March 2021, in line with the usual arrangements. Amendment 9 then makes the same change as regards the timing of the duty to supply electoral registers, and I move Amendment 8.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Minister. Any members with anything they'd like to raise on that point? And no, there aren't. Minister, do you have to speak further? Okay, you're fine. Thank you very much. Then the question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Call Amendment 9, name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 8. And Minister, to move formally?
Moved, Convener.
Moved. Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. And that leaves us to say, question is that Section 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay, and thank you very much for that. So we'll move on to Section 8, which is about multiple days for polling. And so I'd like to call Amendment 24 in the name of Anis Sarwar, grouped with amendments shown in the groupings. And Anis Sarwar, please. Move Amendment 24 and speak to all amendments. Thank you. So.
Thank you, Convener. This is again a probing and discussion amendment. Several members at the debate of Stage 1 last week referenced the multiple polling days. I think it was myself and Patrick Harvey again who referenced the idea that actually multiple polling days should be something that we should think about, not just for this election but for future elections as well, and perhaps using I don't like to use the word using, but taking advantage of the circumstances to test multiple voting days might be a good test bed just now during a pandemic to see the impact of it. So this is a probing amendment to have that discussion about the rights and wrongs of multiple days votings. I should say a couple of added points. One is, what if we were assuming that we're going to have a massive influx of postal vote applications? What if we do not have a massive influx of postal vote applications and we have a very minimal number of applications or postal votes, and therefore it still means that we will have busy polling stations or busier polling stations than we expected? What would be the impact of that, and what reaction would we then have? I would also say that I note from the Minister last week, and also from the private discussion, that he's right to say that we want to limit, I think the number he used was around 800 electors per polling box, but that doesn't take into account individual polling stations in some particularly urban areas. So I use Glasgow as an example. There is a polling place which is in the constituency of the First Minister, for example, where they have over 4,500 electors at one polling place, despite having multiple boxes in that one polling place. So you still have that high level of footfall going into one polling place, but technically looks like it's multiple polling boxes, and so that spread of 800 electors per box. So I just think we need to have a much more clearer understanding of the arrangements on the day, and whether we should have a much fuller discussion about the impact of 1 or 2 days. The additional point that I want to make just on this, which relates to both which relates to Mr. Day's amendments, is about if we do decide who should decide whether we have multiple days. I think fundamentally it should be for Parliament to decide, because ultimately Parliament is responsible to the people. The Electoral Management Board, I accept, has a duty and a role here, but they're not directly answerable to Parliament. Scottish ministers are answerable to Parliament, and I think it should be for Parliament to decide whether we have multiple days or not. And I think having the caveat of it being specifically recommended by the Election Management Board is perhaps a bit trickier, because what happens in the situation where the Election Management Board is saying they neither recommend or not recommend having multiple days, but Parliament decides that we should have multiple days. We should have the ability, I think, to do that. I also think, and this is not to disparage anyone's character, but obviously multiple polling days means more work for some people. So again, I think it should be for Parliament ultimately to decide whether we have more than 1 day or not, rather than it being conditional on a recommendation from the Election Management Board or the Electoral Commission or anyone else for that matter. I don't think Parliament would want to make that decision without having thought about all the implications of it. So I don't think we need that condition. We probably might not need to be in that situation anyway, but I don't think that should be conditional. And it's on that basis that I brought forward this amendment to have these wider discussions.
Thank you very much. Anis Sarwar, are you moving that Amendment 24 then, please?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. And Minister, to speak to Amendment 10 and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. The question of whether and how additional days of polling should be arranged is a difficult one, and this is reflected in the amendments presented today. As with most aspects of the bill, many complex questions arise as to how we can ensure the smooth running of the election, whatever the conditions on polling day. As the committee heard at Stage 1, those who run elections need to know the date of poll well in advance so they can plan and issue clear communications. And crucially, it allows them to book venues and recruit staff. A late decision to switch to multiple days of polling could appear an understandable reaction to a sudden surge in the virus, but it would be expensive and, even worse, confusing for voters. It does seem likely that physical distancing will still be a feature of our lives in May, and that could mean it would take a little longer to cast each vote, and it could result in queues at the polling stations, small queues, although postal vote uptake would of course alleviate that. So at face value, there is something to be said for the approach of Mr Sarwar's Amendment 24 in committing today to a second day of polling. But throughout this process, we've worked very closely with our electoral community. In my Stage 1 evidence, I indicated that I had asked Malcolm Barr, the convener of the Electoral Management Board, to consider the question of multiple days of polling in detail. He delivered his assessment last week, concluding that only one day should be required. Mr Barr's advice is careful and considered and reflects on experience and analysis in reflection on the by-elections held this autumn. It also takes account of the vast experience of returning officers in running Scottish Parliament elections and their plans for the number of polling stations in May 2021. So in parallel to the legislative process, there is considerable work being done at a local level on the practical challenges and measures that would be in play for this election. We've been balancing our approach between uncertainty over virus conditions and the requirements of electoral planning. I remain convinced that the flexible approach of this bill is the right one, and that opting for a rigidity now could result in the need for more legislation in the spring. I hear what Mr Sarwar says about the probing nature of his amendment and that he's looking to promote a discussion about the merits of more than one day for staging an election. I'm not unsympathetic to that, but I absolutely feel that this is not the time to be experimenting with new ways, new approaches to voting. There are enough uncertainties around elections in the current climate, and I think that between that, but more importantly, the advice that we've received from the electoral professionals, the approach that we are intending to take is the right one. As I say, we have the advice of the electoral professionals, but I want to retain the flexibility as well that's in the bill. We don't know for certain what may happen in the coming weeks or so, next couple of months, so I think it's important that we do have that power just in case it's needed. I have, however, listened to the concerns expressed at Stage 1 regarding the width of the power of Scottish ministers to provide for polling over additional days. Amendments 10 and 11 narrow the exercise of the power. Amendment 10 relates to the power of ministers to provide for polling on additional days. It prevents use of the power unless there is a recommendation by the convener of the Electoral Management Board. Again, I would suggest listening to the electoral professionals and being guided by them, but with Parliament having the final say. The effect is that ministers may decide whether to provide for polling that took place on one or more specified days only if polling on those days is recommended to ministers by the convener, and the requirement to consult the persons and bodies listed in Section 8.5 before laying draft regulations remains as an additional safeguard. This will allow ministers flexibility to respond swiftly, but only if electoral administrators feel there is a need. Amendment 11 adjusts subsection 2 of Section 8 to clarify which days may be specified as additional polling days. In any recommendation made to ministers, the convener of the EMB may only specify additional polling days which are consecutive to the day of poll, unless the convener considers there is reason to depart from this presumption, and in any event, the convener may only specify one of the 8 days following immediately after the day of poll. Amendments 12 and 14 make the delegated power to provide for polling over multiple days subject to the affirmative procedure, going further than the recommendation of DPLRC in their Stage 1 report on the bill. As I previously made clear to the committee, this is a contingency power. But on reflection, we agree with DPLRC that if this power were to be used, its significance is such that it's appropriate that there is parliamentary scrutiny. Amendment 13 requires ministers to lay before Parliament a statement of the reasons in support of the change, including information on the responses received from the presiding officer, the Electoral Commission, the convener of the EMB and the CMO. Adam Tompkins' Amendment 15 also seeks to limit the discretion of ministers in this area. As with the government amendments, it seeks to apply the affirmative procedure, but it also applies a number of other restrictions along the lines of those we discussed in relation to Group 4 and an all-postal election. As I said then, it seems excessive to grant a power of veto to each of the presiding officer, the Electoral Commission and the EMB convener. The government's amendments in this area seem to me to be much more in accord with the committee's call for enhanced parliamentary scrutiny of a decision to opt for multiple days of polling. They place the initiation of a change to the days of polling in the hands of the convener of the EMB, but they also enhance parliamentary scrutiny of any change. I think that's to be preferred to Amendment 25. With that said, I see no difficulty in restricting the use of Section 8 to circumstances where Scottish ministers consider it necessary for reasons relating to the coronavirus. If Mr Tompkins does not press his amendment, I would propose to prepare a Stage 3 amendment on that point, one along the lines of Mr Finlay's Amendment 22, which we discussed earlier. In conclusion, and just to avoid any doubt, I would repeat that at present neither I nor the electoral administrators expect the use of the power to be necessary, but the bill is designed for worst-case scenarios. Consequently, I would contend that further restriction beyond that set out in the government amendments is not needed in these circumstances, nor should we commit to a second polling day at this time. So I would invite Mr Sarwar and Mr Tompkins not to press their amendments in this group, but if they are pressed, I would invite the committee not to support them, and I would ask the committee to support the amendments in the group in my name.
Thank you, Minister. And therefore, Adam Tompkins to speak to Amendment 15 and other amendments in the group, please. Adam Tompkins.
Thank you. Something very bizarre has just happened on Blue Jeans. I can now see Michael Russell talking to a different committee rather than what's going on in the committee room that I'm addressing. But hopefully that's something which is not reciprocated and that Michael Russell can't hear or see me. This will do him absolutely no favours whatsoever, I fear, Convener, but I agree with everything that the Minister has just said. I think it's important that we have a degree of flexibility in this bill about the power to provide for polling on additional days, but I think that flexibility should not be in the hands of ministers to the extent that it would have been had the bill been passed in its original form, and I therefore welcome all of his amendments in this group 10, 11, 12, 13 and 14. And as with Section 5, which we discussed a few minutes ago, so too with Section 8, Convener, I won't press my Amendment 15 in this group if the amendments in the name of the Minister are accepted and agreed. And I don't think I have anything else I need to say in addition to that, except that I'm still seeing on my screen the proceedings of another committee and not the proceedings of this one. So if somebody at IT or broadcasting could fix that, that would be helpful. Thank you very much.
It would indeed. Right. Okay, thank you very much, Adam Tompkins. That's a wee bit strange, but there you go. Okay, so thank you for that, Adam. And Anis Sarwar to wind up and press... Sorry? Oh, other members may wish to speak first. I do apologise. I'm just being democratic again. Patrick? Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. The government amendments in this group do obviously make, I think, some welcome change around the advice of the convener of the EMB, the affirmative procedure and the statement of reasons, and I'm pleased to hear that Adam Tompkins would welcome the fact that those amendments themselves would end the possession of this power being solely in the hands of ministers. So I think that's the appropriate approach. I just wanted to say in relation to Amendment 24 from Anis Sarwar, I do think that we should be open to wider reform in this area. And I said during the Stage 1 debate that in a purely personal capacity, because I don't think my party has a formal position on it, I think there is a case not only for having more than one day of polling, but to have an early voting period, as happens in some other countries. I think that debate should be in the context of a wider range of measures that we should be taking to maximise democratic participation, to maximise registration, turnout and political engagement during the election process. Over the years there have been some elements of the participative nature, the kind of theatre around elections that we've lost. Things like placarding, for example. Walk around the kind of areas that Anis Sarwar was talking about when he was moving his amendment in the week or fortnight before an election 10 years ago. It would have been abundantly clear visually that there's an election happening. We don't have that. And there are some good reasons why we don't have that particular type of activity. but I think we need to reflect that we have lost something about the ways in which people are encouraged to engage with the fact that an election is happening. Having an early voting period is only one way of doing that. But I think it's alongside things like where polling places take place. Should they be in or next to supermarkets or shopping centres rather than in schools? Should there be a wider range of options for how we deal with those challenges? You know, I think that those issues deserve debate in their own right. I can see at one level the argument that an election during a pandemic might be seen as an opportunity to trial something like that. The flip side of that argument, though, is that if we're doing it precisely for this reason, because of coronavirus reasons, then the next election we have, the argument would have disappeared. You know, the people who recognised that was the reason why it happened would say, well, there isn't a pandemic on now, so we have to go back to the way it was done before. So we wouldn't actually have advanced that deeper argument about what should be the changes that we contemplate for the longer term. There has been electoral innovation in recent years around extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, around some limited changes on prisoner voting, and around extending the franchise regardless of citizenship, making it based on residency. Those kind of innovations have had a degree of debate on their own terms, rather than simply being seen as an immediate change for a temporary circumstance. So I would like to see us continue to debate these wider range of measures, including an early voting period, which might have long-term value, permanent value in our election system. I think I am, at the moment, cautious about committing to that by supporting Amendment 24, particularly in light of the evidence that we've taken that in these current circumstances, electoral administrators are advising for a single day's polling. So I'm grateful that we've had this debate. I think it needs wider and longer term debate about what's the approach that we should have to these issues in regards to elections generally, and I'm not convinced now that we should do it specifically for the context of an election during the current pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. I think we've got Maureen Watt first and then Neil Findlay.
Yes, I'll be brief, Convener, thank you. Although I'm not going to dare comment on whether Minister here or Mike Russell is easier on the eye of Adam Tompkins, but I hope he's got it sorted out. I think Patrick Harvey's very much said, and Anas Sarwar has said what I would say. We have had lots of extensions to the franchise and changed the way that we run elections. And I would agree that we should keep looking at that and be innovative, but I really don't think in the midst of a pandemic it's the time to start and look at making changes to that, although I do hope future parliaments will look at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Neil Findlay, please.
I don't know who's easier on the eye, but I certainly know who's easier on the ear. But if we had... I'll give you the benefit of that one. If we had the issue in voting at polling day of the problem that we saw in the first South African elections, with people queuing miles long and waiting ages to vote, then I could understand why we were taking such a conservative vote on all of these issues that's about opening up voting and participation. We've got 55% at best people voting in elections. It's pathetic. That number is pathetic. And yet what we've seen today and what we see is that there is real conservatism, I think, within any approach to expanding that. I thought people would have been up for that during the time of this crisis. I would have hoped people would have been up for it at any time, but it seems not, and that is a pretty, I think that's a pretty depressing situation.
Thank you very much. As soon as Neil Findlay mentions conservatism, John Scott's hand went up there, but John Scott, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with the Minister on this, position. I must say I don't think there's any need for Amendment 24, particularly with Anas Sarwar expecting almost 50% of the people, or hoping that 50% of the people may vote by postal votes, or certainly being concerned that they might and there might not be the capacity for that. So that's going to vastly reduce the numbers who are going to need to go to polling stations, and therefore I don't see that there is a need for 2 days. If Neil Finlay is correct in that there's only going to be 55% of the electorate voting, that takes the electorate going through the polling stations down to half of 55%, which is only 27.5%. So I don't think there's a need for 2 days. I agree with others that we have to look at this in future if we want to, but I don't think there's a compelling argument being made for it just now, especially as the EMB are content and believe, and we have to, everybody to their job, we have to accept that when they say that they can carry out this election in 1 day, that they will be able to do that. And so also Mr. Burr's letter, as cited by the Minister, also gave us that confidence. So I don't think, while we're not saying we shouldn't change or look at this again in the future, I don't think now is the time.
Right, thank you very much, John. Okay, so I think we can move on to Anas Sarwar to wind up and press withdraw Amendment 24, please. Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Convener. I've got to say, I find some of the responses a little bit depressing in terms of a lack of ambition, in terms of trying to open up and encourage our democracy. I think there's a risk here. I've certainly not set the ambition at 50% being applying by post. I'm open-minded to about how people will eventually vote. I just do think that there is a disconnect between raising awareness and ease of applying to vote by post, and then what that means for what action actually happens at the polling stations. What if we haven't made it actually easier for people to apply to vote by post, so we have less than we expect people applying for post, therefore more people than we expect going to polling stations in a socially distanced election? And in terms of legacy, Patrick, I think makes lots of very important points, but one particular point that struck me was, if it's just a coronavirus election, what would be the reason to do it in future elections? We've got an opportunity to actually, due to a coronavirus election, make it easier for people to vote and drive the turnout out to, why not 60, 70, 80% of the electorate? And then that becomes the reason why we say to people, actually, look, even during a pandemic, we had record levels of turnout, like we've had in other parts of the world. We've had record levels of turnout. That shows when we make it easier for people to vote, increase their options for how they vote, they actually come out and engage in the electoral process. I do think there is a missed opportunity here. I still also think we need a response about, if there is going to be a lot more people at polling places rather than polling boxes, what's our reaction to that late on, in terms of ensuring we have not long queues and an adequately socially distanced election that doesn't risk either those voting or indeed poll workers. But I'm not planning on pressing that amendment, Convener. Can I just make one other point, though, on the other amendments? So I wholly support the principles of what both Graham Day and Adam Tompkins are trying to do with their amendments. I agree with amendments 11, 12, 13, 14. And again, but I do have one concern about Amendment 10, and I recognise if Amendment 10 passes, then Adam Tompkins' amendment will be withdrawn. Amendment 15 was my understanding, sorry, at least, is, and this is not as a slight on the convener of the Election Management Board. Of course, we have to take their advice very, very seriously. I still again emphasise, I don't think we should make it conditional on a direct recommendation from the Election Management Board, because what if the Election Management Board neither recommends for or recommends against multiple days, but Parliament thinks we should have more than 1 day and we're able to deliver that? So on that basis, I would ask that we can please work with the other parties to try and find a suitable wording around that. Ultimately, it's in the hand of Parliament, not in the hands of the convener of the Election Management Board, and then us just affirming that position. So on that basis, I will not be pressing Amendment 24, and would ask that the Minister and other parties work together on finding better language, I think, for Amendment 10, and if it is pushed to vote, to not support at this stage, but to support 11, 12, 13, 14 instead. Or anyway, sorry.
No, not at all. Thank you very much, Anas Sarwar. So the member has indicated he wishes to withdraw Amendment 24. Does any member wish to object to the amendment being withdrawn? No one does, so Amendment 24 has been withdrawn. Thanks, Anas Sarwar. I call Amendments 10, 11, 12, 13 and 14 all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. I invite the Minister to move Amendments 10 to 14 en bloc.
Moved, Convener.
Moved en bloc. Does any member object to a single question being put in Amendments 10 to 14? Yes, Neil Finlay, please.
Yes, I just object to them being moved on block, and we go through them individually.
Okay, yep, no problem at all. Okay then, so we're going to move them individually. And amendment number 10, please. Support for amendment 10, please. Thank you. Okay, and object to amendment 10, please. Thank you very much. Thank you. And so we have result of the vote on Amendment 10 in the name of the Minister is yes 6, no 1, and therefore the amendment is agreed. And thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so we'll Amendment 11, please. The amendment question is Amendment 11 be agreed to. Is that Amendment 11? Is agreed. Thank you. Amendment 12 be agreed to. Agreed. Thank you. Amendment 13 be agreed to. Thank you. And Amendment 14 be agreed to. Thank you very much for that, everyone. Okay. So call Amendment 15 in the name of Adam Tompkins, already debated with Amendment 24, and ask Adam Tompkins to move or not move, please.
Convener, could you please declare the results for Amendments 11, 12, 13 and 14?
Did you pick up on that? Beg your pardon. Yep. Okay. So Amendments 11, 12, 13 and 14 were all agreed. Did you get Amendment?
Thank you. On that basis, thank you, Convener. I appreciate that. And on that basis, and in the light of what the Minister said about the provision in my amendment relating to reasons relating to coronavirus, I will not press Amendment 15.
Amendment 15 not pressed. Thank you very much, Adam Tompkins. Did any other member wish to move that Amendment 15? No one does. I thank you all very much for that. So therefore, the question is that Section 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Okay, so we move on to information on elections. Call Amendment 25 in the name of Anas Sarwar in a group of its own, and Anas Sarwar to move and speak to Amendment 25, please. Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Convener. I'm sure you and the committee will be pleased that this is my final amendment, and then that'll be me for the morning. I raised this issue at stage 1 in the debate last week, and I know there's been discussions with the Minister offline and with others. This is actually quite a simple amendment in terms of its principle, but there's obviously a bit more detail. And the principle of it being that it's a recognition that the Scottish Government is a participant in the election rather than a spectator in the election. And that's why any information in relation to the election that is being communicated should be communicated from a neutral, in inverted commas, source, and those sources being the Electoral Commission, the Election Management Board, or the electoral registration officers. For the avoidance of doubt, that when I refer to information in relation to the 2021 elections, that does not include election communications from political parties. I don't want any part of this amendment to read or mean that it restricts political parties in any way from communicating with the electorate. I think it's welcome that we're going to have a public information campaign led by the Electoral Commission rather than being a Scottish Government campaign. I think it's welcome that the booklet that is going to go out is going to be from the Electoral Commission rather than from the Scottish Government. I also welcome the commitment from the Scottish Government that they'll be writing to the 169,000 shielding category people about their ability to vote by post. I do believe, though, that communication should be coming from the Electoral Commission rather than from the Scottish Government. Again, I would also plea, if we're writing to this shielding group, please include an application form with that communication and a free post mechanism. It would be counterintuitive to again encourage shielding the category the most vulnerable in our society to either have to go out and buy a stamp on an envelope to send an application form back, or have to navigate an ERO helpline or indeed the website or emails in order to apply for post. And then some clarification from the government if they're planning on any other communication that we might not have picked up on around the election process and being able to vote, and on whose name that would be going out. I would also emphasise from my discussion with the Minister that one of the reasons he gave me for why he thought it needed to be a Scottish Government communication to the 169,000 shielding group was because it was Scottish Government data. I would remind him that we gave the shielding category data to supermarkets, and if it's okay to give the data to supermarkets, it's okay to give the data to the Electoral Commission. So I would urge him, please, to have any communications going out from the Electoral Commission, and if he wants that within that communication, comment from the CMO, the Chief Medical Officer, which he intimated last week. There is no reason why that Chief Medical Officer's information could not be on an Electoral Commission communication. I do think that we've got to have no... This is not paranoia. I know you commented on paranoia last week. I would suggest perhaps the paranoia might be on the other side. I think we all want to make sure that no one can have any questions asked about the conduct of the election, and that's why using those neutral sources, Electoral Commission, Election Management Board or ERO offices for all communications in terms of the conduct of the election, I think is a really, really important principle, and one that I would hope would have unanimous support of the committee and indeed of the Parliament.
Thank you, Anis Sarwar. And you're moving Amendment 25 then?
Moved, Convener.
Moved. Thank you very much indeed for that. Any other members? Patrick Harvey, please.
Thank you. I think that point of principle Anas Sarwar sets out is one that we would all agree with, that information about the conduct and process of the election does need to be politically independent. But I do think that the amendment goes significantly further in that regard than we've ever seen for other elections. I don't think that the current circumstances justify a significant departure from that previous expectation that we've had. And I do think that there's a danger that this amendment, as it's currently drafted, would inhibit necessary information which is politically independent and which comes from other sources than those mentioned. In particular, I'm not clear why the exemption at subsection 2 only refers to political parties rather than to candidates. And I think the arguments around the role of the Chief Medical Officer having been a clear and consistent and politically impartial voice during the pandemic are well made. I don't see a reason to say that that's an inappropriate or a politically loaded thing to do. I don't think it is. So I think the principle is well understood and agreed, but I think this amendment goes significantly further than merely maintaining that important principle, and I think there could be serious unintended consequences.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harvey. No one else at the moment, so I'd like to move to the Minister, please.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 25 causes me very great concern. I'm afraid it hasn't been thought through. It greatly restricts those who can provide information to those entitled to vote at the 2021 election. It would mean that only the Electoral Commission, the convener of the Electoral Management Board and electoral registration officers could provide information. As returning officers who are responsible in law for delivering elections are not listed, they would be prohibited from any form of communication with the voters. They would not be able to publicise the date of the election or to send out polling cards telling people where they are to vote, even though they have a statutory duty to do this. An exception is made in the amendment for election communications from political parties, but under the terms of the amendment as drafted, independent candidates would be excluded from providing information about the election to voters. Now, this is surely not what Anna Sarwar intended, but it would be the consequence, and it would be considered would create very obvious difficulties in the conduct of the election. It could also prevent the NHS, the Chief Medical Officer and others from issuing information about the election in the context of the virus, as we've heard, to shielding persons. I think as Patrick Harvey identified, the CMO is the impartial source of information that those in the shielding category have come to rely upon. He is credible and he's established. But just to update the committee, because this has been an ongoing discussion leading up to stage 1 and since, I've had confirmation this morning that the Chief Medical Officer is content to issue a communication to advise those in the shielding list of how to apply for a postal vote and should they wish to do so, and the deadline for applications. The communications will not be issued on behalf of Scottish ministers, and that would be done in consultation with the Electoral Commission. So the Electoral Commission would provide the form of wording to be used. The point was raised about any intended Scottish Government communication in the context of the election. As we speak, there is no such plan. I will be meeting the Electoral Management Board, the Electoral Commission and the EROs on Monday to further discuss, as identified earlier, what the information campaign will look like in detail, I hope on a very localised level, and I would aim to be in a position to advise Parliament in the context of the Stage 3 debate next week.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Okay then, so move to Anas Sarwar to wind up on Amendment 25 and press or withdraw his amendment, please. Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Convener. I take on board the comments made by both Mr Harvey and the Minister. I think if we can get a commitment from the Minister that if any communications were to be decided, that there would be full consultation with the Parliament. When I say communication, I mean from a Scottish Government perspective, there would be consultation with the Parliament, and then that would then be agreed that it should come from a neutral source unless the Parliament agrees with what was being proposed. Also, in terms of the shielding category, just some clarification whether that's going to be branded with the, I know the wording will be approved by the Electoral Commission, but will that be branded with the Scottish Government branding or NHS Scotland branding? The CMO is, of course, an NHS Scotland employee, so there is no reason why there should be Scottish Government branding on those communications. And I take the point about individual candidates and also third-party campaign bodies. But I think if we can get a reassurance and a guarantee from the Minister that there will be neutral communications going out and that the shielding category will come from a neutral source as well, and none of it will be branded with the Scottish Government, then I, on that basis, would be content not to press this amendment, or indeed feel the need to bring it back at stage 3.
Minister, would you choose to come back at this point?
I'm happy to come back, and I will always resist the temptation to use the word I used in the Stage 1 debate, paranoia. To offer some reassurance, the branding, as I understand it, will be from the Chief Medical Officer, as the other communication with the shielding category has been. In terms of further any communication from the Scottish Government is concerned, I think we have demonstrated throughout all of this that the source, the principal source of information on the election has been the Electoral Commission, and as I've indicated earlier, we're looking for the EROs to do that localised information campaigning as well. I just hesitate very slightly to give the commitment, a binding commitment of the type that he is looking for, because in a circumstance where perhaps the election had to be cancelled at short notice and there were consequences flowing from that, it might be that it was necessary for a communication to go out from the Scottish Government. I stress might be. So I'm going to stop short of giving him that absolute guarantee, but I would point him to the direction of travel we've had through this election, where the sources of information have been other than directly from the Scottish Government.
Thank you, Minister. So, Anas Sarwar then.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. I don't think you need to worry about paranoia. I would hope that a Government Minister would take every opportunity to say that there would be no political interference in terms of the conduct of an election. So I would hope that you would take every opportunity to make that point, that we have a free and fair democratic process that will not have political interference in terms of the conduct of that election. I take the point the Minister makes about the slight caveat. I would add a slight caveat back, which is if the government was intending, or we were intending, to cancel an election, I'm pretty sure, or at least I would hope, that the government would be consulting other political parties before making any such announcement. So I will take these comments and conversations offline with the Minister and with other political parties, and at this stage I'm content not to press the amendment.
Okay, so you're not pressing, so I withdraw. Thank you. The member has indicated he wishes to withdraw. And does any member wish to object to the amendment being withdrawn at this stage? They do not. So, okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Anna Sarwar, for that. Okay, so we're moving on to section 9. Nomination of First Minister following election. And call Amendment 16 in the name of the Minister in a group of its own. And the Minister to move and speak to Amendment 16, please, Minister.
Thank you, Convener. I noted earlier, and members are well aware, that there's an expedited process around this bill. Nevertheless, the evidence-taking process has given us cause to reflect on the bill as drafted. Earlier we had a technical amendment, and this amendment, again, is based upon reflection on what's come out through the evidence gathering process. Amendment 16 is consequential to the power given to the presiding officer in section 9 to fix the day on which the Scottish Parliament is first to meet after the 2021 election. Under section 46 of the Scotland Act 1998, the new Parliament must nominate one of its members for appointment as First Minister within 28 days of a general election. As the first meeting of a new Parliament would normally take place within 7 days of the election, in practice the minimum time available to the Parliament for the nomination of the First Minister would be 21 days. Section 2 of the bill removed the usual period allowed for the first meeting of the new Parliament. Instead, Section 9 of the bill requires the presiding officer to fix a day for the first meeting of the new Parliament, which must be as soon as reasonably practicable after the poll. This is because we can anticipate that counting of votes will take longer than usual, and if there is a need for additional polling days, as we've discussed, Parliament may not be able to meet for a longer period than usual. The effect of Amendment 16 is that any postponement of the first meeting of the new Parliament beyond a 7-day period is not counted towards the period of 28 days allowed for nomination of a new First Minister. That applies whether or not the election goes ahead on the 6th May 2021 or is postponed by the presiding officer under Section 11 of the bill. This is simply to ensure that any delay to the first meeting of the Parliament caused for public health reasons does not have a knock-on impact on the usual timetable for nominating a First Minister.
Thank you very much for that. Any members have anything to contribute at the moment? There are not. So, Minister, would you care to wind up?
Just move the amendment in my name.
Just move the amendment. Thank you very much. Okay. So the question is Amendment 16 to be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. It's all agreed. So the question then is that Section 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And we are all agreed that Section 9 is agreed to. Question is that Section 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay, thank you. So Section 10 is also agreed. Move on to Section 11, which is the power of the presiding officer to postpone an election, or the election. So I'd like to call Amendment 26 in the name of Neil Finlay, grouped with Amendment 27, and Neil Finlay to move Amendment 26 and speak to both amendments in the group, please.
Thanks, Convener. These amendments 26 and 27 seeks to restrict the power of the presiding officer to postpone the election. The contingency measure where the presiding officer would be expected to take such a decision to postpone the Scottish general election should only come into play where the presiding officer considers that it is necessary to do so for reasons related to coronavirus only. The principle of this is similar to the Amendment 22, which the government accepted, and I hope that they would accept these amendments as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, and do
And
you
I'll
move
move
that?
that. Yes,
Neil?
moved.
Yes, you do. Thank you very much indeed. So Amendment 26 has been moved. And any other members with... yes, Patrick Harvey, please.
Thank you, Convener. I can see that at some level it might be attractive to remove the word appropriate and only retain the word necessary. And while both are framed in the bill at the moment as whether the presiding officer considers it appropriate or necessary, I would worry that the removal of appropriate implies that it's more of an objective test than a judgment, and that if in the hopefully unlikely circumstances that the presiding officer felt the need to exercise this power, there could be a legal challenge on the basis of whether it could be proved necessary rather than judged appropriate. I'd be interested to hear what the Minister says about this amendment, but I've got my qualms about it.
Okay, thank you very much. No other member wishes to speak, so the Minister, please. Thank you.
Convener, as members will be aware, the presiding officer has always had a power to advance or postpone the election by 1 month. For the 2021 poll, we've replaced that with a power to defer the poll by whatever period or periods the presiding officer thinks necessary or appropriate. However, those periods cannot delay the poll in total by more than 6 months. Amendments 26 and 27 would seek to restrict that power so it could only be exercised for a reason related to the coronavirus, and even then only if Parliament cannot safely meet. But this power needs to be broader because it could be required for a reason unrelated to the coronavirus, such as a terrorist attack or the demise of the Crown. So let me be clear, I don't expect the presiding officer will need to exercise this power. Under section 11.3, he can only exercise it for a coronavirus-related reason if he's satisfied that the Parliament cannot meet. But other circumstances could arise where reconvening the Parliament is difficult or unable to be achieved, despite the delayed dissolution under the bill. I trust the presiding officer, well, I certainly trust, and I'm sure members will, the presiding officer to make that judgment. I hope we will never see that occasion arising, but it is essential, in my opinion, that the presiding officer retains what I see as a power in reserve, which can cover issues unrelated to the coronavirus, as he's been able to do since the establishment of the Parliament. Given the issues that I've outlined, I would ask Mr Finlay not to press his amendments 26 and 27, and if he does, I would urge members not to support them.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Neil Finlay to wind up, please, and press or withdraw Amendment 26?
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I think this is an important amendment, and you know, the bill is referring to the Scottish General Election coronavirus bill. Therefore, it is specifically relating to coronavirus, and I think that that is what the amendment seeks to point out, that it should only be that those interventions take place if it is for COVID-related reasons, and I would continue and press the amendments.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil Finlay. So the question then is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Okay, thank you very much. So we will be a division, and I would ask those in favour of Amendment 26 to raise their hands, please. Yep, sorry, I was wondering there. Thanks, Neil. And those against to raise their hands, please. Thank you. And are there any abstentions? Okay, well, thank you very much for that. So the result of voting Amendment 26 is in the name of Neil Finlay is yes 1, no 6, no abstentions, and the amendment is therefore not agreed to. Okay, so I call Amendment 27 in the name of Neil Finlay, already debated with Amendment 26, and ask Neil Finlay to move or not move, please. Moved, thank you. So the question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not all agreed. So the question is that beg your pardon. So therefore there will be a division, and those in favour, please raise their hands. Thank you. And those against? Okay, thank you. And therefore the result of the amendment on the vote on Amendment 27 is in the name of Neil Finlay is yes 1, no 6, and the amendment is therefore not agreed to. Thank you very much for that. Okay. So the question is that section 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. And the question is that sections 12 to 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. Okay, so we move on to section 15, which is on commencement, and call amendment 17 in the name of the Minister in a group of its own. Minister, to move and speak to amendment 17, please.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 17 deletes section 15.2 from the bill. The effect of this amendment is to remove Ministers' power to make transitional, transitory or saving provision in connection with the coming into force of any of the provisions of the bill. This fulfils the recommendation made by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee in its report on the bill at stage 1 that this power was unnecessary. Upon reflection, given the power to make similar provision already is present in section 14 of the bill, we agree with that and so have brought forward this amendment, and I would ask members to support that.
Thank you very much. Any members with anything to raise at this point? No. Okay, thank you very much. Minister, just to wind up there, please.
I'm content simply to move, Convener.
And you're moving, and thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Okay, then, the question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. And the question is that Section 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Question also is that Section 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? And the question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Now, that ends stage 2 consideration of the bill, which will now be reprinted as amended at stage 2 and will be published on the website 8:30 a.m. tomorrow, following the Parliament's approval of motion S5M 23471. Stage 3 is scheduled for the meeting of the Parliament on the 23rd of December 2020. The deadline for lodging stage 3 amendments is 12 noon on Monday the 21st of December. Amendments should be lodged with the legislation team by that time. And I'd like to thank everyone there for that. And that ends the public part of the meeting. The committee will now move into private session. I'd like to thank Anis Sarwar and Adam Tompkins. And I'd like to thank the Minister and his officials for attending. And thank you all. Thank you very much.